Chapter 3. The friendship that had grown up between Olav Audunsson and his kinsfolk at Ringjul and Skikjustad was declining again. Una had gone so far that day in the spring, when he sailed her home, that they could not honourably carry the matter further, and Olaf made no move. So they avoided each other. That the people of Ringjul resented it, Olaf was well aware. How his conduct was interpreted by his neighbours he had a chance of hearing one day, when he met Sira Halbjorn down on the wharf. The priest burst out in his abrupt way. "A great gull you were, Olav, to take up again with that Torhild woman. She coaxed you into buying her wretched cot, and worse than that, you let her spoil a good marriage for you. What idle talk is this?" Olaf's face turned red as fire. "I ask counsel of no one, either in buying land or taking a wife. In such things I will do as I will." "Pooh! You think so, I can well believe. You thought, no doubt, you had your will with her when she did as she willed. Torhild Bjornsdatter is the wiser of you two. Beware now, Olaf, that she doesn't make another halter for you of her girdle." Olaf replied angrily, "However it is, this can be no concern of yours, Sira Halbjorn, so long as I have not lain with her again. Perhaps I may take counsel where I will. I have not begged it of you." He turned his back and leapt down into his boat. But afterwards a raging desire for Torhild flared up in him again, day and night, simply to take her to him in defiance. If folk were resolved to meddle with his affairs, then let them have something to meddle with. And Bjorn. He had banned the child's memory, driven back his thoughts whenever they would go that way. Now it came upon him. Was it worth the trouble? So many a thing had gone amiss with him. Should he not, after all, take what good there was to take? Waking and sleeping, he dreamt of his son. But behind the image of the little fair-skinned boy, he saw the other fair child, Cecilia. For her sake he must stand firm and deny himself that which he desired. It would not be good for her to grow up in a house of which her father's leman was mistress. Not yet had he wrecked Cecilia's future, and he would not do so either. Olaf saw little of his daughter now. If she ran out into the yard to play, and her father stopped to speak to her, Cecilia had scarce time to answer him. At night she slept with Ragnar in Torhild's old house. But Ragnar was only a poor serving woman, unfitted to rear the daughter of a man of Olaf's condition when the maid grew a little older. Moreover, Ragnar had all the household duties to perform, and her own 3 children to herd. The eldest lay outside the house door all day long, drivelling and snoring and rocking his great head. The poor child lacked something of his wits. But the year-old twins were lively as kittens, and could be seen creeping and crawling everywhere in the yard and across the thresholds. Olaf was at his wits' end to know what to do with his daughter, to have her brought up in seemly fashion. Maybe this would have been easier if he had married Dissa, though one never knows with any woman how she will turn out as a stepmother. And there was this leave hanging about the place early and late. Cecilia clung to her. She remembered no other mother. Then, quite unexpectedly, a way appeared out of these difficulties, it seemed to Olaf. One day 2 townsmen from Tunsberg came to him with a message that Asger Magnusson lay dying in the Premonstratensian convent in their town, and would speak with him. Olaf had nothing special to do that day, and the wind was fair, so he sailed over at once. It seemed strange to him that they should thus come up again in his life, one after another, the men he had known in his youth, and for years had well nigh forgotten. It was almost as if he had come out of the fairy hill, and as they say of those whom the fairies have carried off, so it was with him. he felt a stranger among these men, and cared little for them one way or the other. Not that there had ever been any warmth of feeling between him and Halvard Steinfinnsson or the men of Hvit. Asger, on the other hand, had been his friend. They were distantly related to one another, and when he was in Denmark, he and Asger had associated not a little, though they had never had much to say to one another. This friendship was the only tie that had not been broken, of those he had formed in his days of outlawry. Apart from this, the years with his uncle at Vikings Bay seemed to Olaf like a half-forgotten dream. But Asger had come hither to Norway with the banished Danish lords, and so they had been brothers in arms on the raids against Denmark. At the thought of those war summers, Olaf's heart rejoiced. He longed to see his comrade again. He caught himself feeling thus as he stood at the steering oar, keeping an eye on the familiar sea marks. Asger was surely not so dying as the townsman said. It would not be like him. But next morning after Mass, when he was taken to the upper chamber where the Dane lay abed, he saw at once that death could not be far off. Asger's great broad face was greenish-grey beneath his red beard, and his powerful, rather hoarse voice had shrunk to a broken wheeze. And he said as much himself as soon as he saw his friend. "'Tis all over with me now, Olaf." On a chest under the little dormer in the gable sat an old woman and a little girl. The woman stood up and gave her hand to Olaf when he greeted her. Her appearance was such as to cause some wonder in Olaf. She was a good head taller than he, broad-shouldered, thin and erect in her black weeds. Outside her coif she wore a dark blue widow's veil. The narrow face, white as bone, must once have been passing fair. Her great blue eyes still shone beneath bushy iron-grey brows, and the ridge of her fine hooked nose was glossy as ivory. But her cheeks were furrowed with long wrinkles, and she had strong tufts of grey hair at the corners of her mouth. She was the mother of Asger's wife, and her name was Marta Biggersdatter. Olaf had never before heard of any living woman being called Marta, but this one looked as though she brought no shame on her patroness, the good lady of Bethany. She went out at once, and Olaf seated himself on the edge of his friend's bed. Asger was now an outlaw both in Norway and in Denmark. He had had the misfortune to slay a rich man in his home district of Hising, where his wife had brought him an estate, and the slain man was a friend both of King Hakon and of Count Jacob. Nevertheless he had fled hither to Tunsberg. He was well known of old in the convent here, and so sick was he that they might well let him rest in peace while treating for his atonement, or die in sanctuary. For the abbot maintained that this convent had right of asylum, though it was doubtful if this had ever been confirmed. But whatever might be the upshot of this, there was his mother-in-law and his child. Would Olaf take them in? Olaf said yes at once, and gave Asger his hand upon it. He had heard at the time that Asger had made a good marriage in the south, but now Asger told him that his wife had died 3 years before, and he himself had been broken in health of late years, after he had been shipwrecked one winter. He had suffered some inward hurt, and since then he had been spitting blood and had little joy of his food. "And yet you were not so broken, but that you cut down Paul in his shirt of mail?" asked Olaf, and could not resist smiling. Asger laughed and coughed weakly. It was the mother-in-law, Olaf guessed, who had been most helpful in drawing Asger into these quarrels. Indeed, she looked to be the right one for that, and Asger had never been wont to sing small either. But the man was used to the ups and downs of fortune, and now he took his ill luck calmly. But his child's future seemed to weigh heavily on the father's mind. Olaf turned his eyes to the little girl sitting on the chest. he held out a hand to her. "Come hither, Bothild, my foster daughter that are to be. Shall we talk together, you and I?" The child sat still as a mouse, and when the strange man spoke to her, she dropped her eyelids. She had thick black lashes. She was a little bigger than Cecilia, 6 winters old, her father said. Olaf saw that she was a most comely child, although she resembled Asger. She had the same broad face as he, a low broad forehead, eyes far apart, and a short square chin. But her skin was bright and clear, her forehead white as milk under the smooth auburn hair that lay in 2 heavy plaits over her chest. When she looked up at Olaf for an instant, her eyes were a pure sky blue. The lay brother who had come up with Olaf had given her a big apple, and there she sat, clasping it untasted with both hands. She looked so still and timid, as though she understood how friendless and forlorn she was in the world. Olaf had never liked the smell of apples. It seemed to him mawkish or musty, and now it was mingled with the smell of sickness and bedstraw and fusty woolen garments. And the sight of the child's motionless grief stirred up a flood of vague tenderness and pain in Olaf's breast. Memories of all the defenceless children he had seen in the course of his life, of mortal wounds inflicted on the weak and helpless, and every thought he had had of his own children if they should be orphaned, of the child whose father he was, but over whom he could never have a father's right. All this passed through his mind like a stream of shadows. He went over to where the little maid was sitting and caressed her soft, cool cheek. "Will you not look at me, Bothild? I mean you well. I have a daughter at home. Her name is Cecilia. You are to be foster sisters and live together. How will that please you?" Without a sound, Bothild slid down off the chest and slipped under Olaf's arm. She was away to her father's couch, nestled up to him, and took his hand in both of hers. "I will be with you, dear father mine," she said miserably. Olaf picked up her apple from the floor and gave it to her. Asger Magnusson opened his little bright blue eyes wide, as though in great pain. His voice was feeble with helplessness. "You must not take it amiss, kinsman Olaf. I have given this daughter of mine her way, more than was good for her." He put his arm about her and clasped the child's dark little head against his shoulder. "You must not think ill of her for this." "No, no." Olaf sat on the bedstead and turned his eyes away. He felt quite abashed with pity for them both. About a month later, Olaf received a message that Asger Magnusson was dead, but it was not until after Yule that he could sail down and fetch the old woman and the child. The abbot told Olaf that the dead man's goods had been seized, but doubtless Marta Biggersdatter had saved no small store of movables in that great chest of hers. Since Asger, when living, had always proved himself a friend of the monks, the abbot offered, if Olaf would rather escape the charge of the poor child, to give him a letter to the lady grower in Oslo, asking if she would take Bothild for the love of God. The little maid seemed well fitted to be a nun, for she was quiet and gentle, a winning child. Olaf thanked him, but said he had promised the dead man to be to Bothild in the place of a father. As Olaf left the abbot's chamber, he ran straight upon the child. She was on her knees in the gallery, playing chucky stones. The weather was bitter and boisterous. Sleet and snow blew in under the roof of the gallery, so Olaf spoke to her, bidding her get up. Bothild did not answer, but obeyed at once. Olaf took her by the hand. It was icy cold, and he rubbed her hands between his. He had occasion to go down to his boat, and he asked if she would go with him. Bothild nodded, and he led her down. Her little hand lay so submissively within his that it made him fond. If he took Cecilia's, it slipped away again at once. She would never walk quietly by the side of a grown person. But he could not get a word out of his foster daughter beyond a faint yes or no. He took Bothild with him back to the guest chamber, and as he sat down by the fire to dry himself, he drew Bothild up upon his knee. She settled herself there, leaning her head against his breast. Such a sweet scent came from her hair. Olaf lifted up her face and kissed her on the mouth, felt the living movement of the soft, childish lips. She kissed him back. A warm, melting thrill went through him. Eirik had often been ready to sit on his knees when he was small, but Cecilia always wanted to get down as soon as he had picked her up, and if it chanced that he tried to kiss his little daughter, he noticed that Cecilia did not like it. For the last year Olaf had slept in the hearth-room, in the bed that had been his marriage bed. He slept better than he had done for many years, but even now he often lay long awake. At such times it was pleasanter to lie here than in the closet. There the daylight never penetrated, so that its air was always chillingly sour and musty, and there was always a cold raw smell of oil and food that they stored in there during the winter. The great room smelt of men and smoke. Even at night a hint of cosiness seemed to be given off by the hearth, where live embers were hidden beneath the ashes. A piece had been broken off the cover of the smoke vent one night when it was blowing, and Olaf had not yet had a new one made. When the moon shone, he could see a corner of light on the parchment pane of the vent, and he could watch the dawn. Olaf liked that. Now he moved back into the closet. Marta and the children were to have the south bed in the hearth-room. Olav had expected Cecilia to scream and make a great to-do when she was told she was to sleep with the strangers instead of with Ragnar, as she had been accustomed. But it turned out otherwise. He had come into Hestviken late in the day, having taken 3 days on the voyage from Tunsberg, as he had met with bad weather and run for shelter. Bothild was more dead than alive when Olaf carried her up to the houses. She sat the whole evening on the stool where he had first put her down, feeling as if she was still in the boat. Folk tramped in and out, carrying one thing and another, and meanwhile Cecilia Olafsdatter hovered about the strange little maid, and her big bright eyes were all agaze under the tumble of flaxen curls. No sooner had Marta laid the poor exhausted little thing under the bedclothes, and Olaf said that now Cecilia must go and lie down by her foster sister, than she pulled off all her clothes in a twinkling and jumped up into the bed. Soon after Marta came with a pillow. She took hold of Bothild, who was already asleep, to put it under her head. Instantly Cecilia threw her arm around the strange child. "You shall not touch her! This is my sister!" It was a jest among folk in the countryside that now at last Olav Audunsson had gotten a heritage from his rich kinsman in Denmark. He had inherited a mother-in-law. They soon found a name to call her by, and dubbed her the Lady Marta. Olaf got on well with the new mistress of his house. He was spared further trouble with such matters as did not rightly come under his control, and she seemed to be kind to Cecilia. Galfrid Richardson owed Olaf some money, and now he asked him to accept in payment a handsome, well-trained falcon. Galfrid had bought her in the spring of an Icelander, but he himself had little skill in hawking and wished to be rid of the bird. Olaf knew of old that it was difficult to nest these birds at Hestviken, so that they kept in good condition over the winter, nor had he any horse now that would serve for hawking. Nevertheless, he could not control his desire to own this fine bird. He rode out with her a few mornings before the snow came. Most days he only got black game, but once or twice it happened that he had the luck to see the falcon hunt kites. When he came home, warmed and cheered by the fine sight of the struggle in the air, Eirik had the benefit of his father's good humour. When the boy talked of catching young hawks in the spring and taming them for hunting, Olav laughed a little. It was not so easy for an unpractised hand, but he had known something of it in his youth, and he promised to help Eirik as well as he could. It was the lad's work to change the sand and keep the bird's cage clean. His father taught him how to handle the falcon, to slip on the hood and fasten the jesses on the legs. The man and the boy became good friends over this bird. Then the kites left the country and the snow came. Olav had set up a perch for the falcon within the closet and hung up some old blankets for a curtain. At night, when the walls were rough with rime and the coverlet over him was frosted with his breath, he lay listening for any movement of the falcon. He was anxious lest she might fare badly and be useless in the spring. Every day he examined her shanks and castings, watched whether she fed. He was still strangely happy in the possession of this treasure, so proud and wild, and yet so frail and easily spoilt. He loved to feel the weight of her on his wrist. He carried her into the light and looked at her fine markings, the greyish bands and pale brown spots that showed in her white plumage. At night, when all smells were deadened by the cold, he thought nevertheless he could catch the rank scent of the bird of prey, and then he looked forward with longing to the spring, as he had not done since he knew not when. The deer had left the district after the last 2 winters, when wolves were rife. As the new year wore on, Olav remarked several times that there was dissension in the house, because Eirik set himself against Lady Marta. Olav was very angry, for now he wished for peace. He corrected the boy with harsh words, but this seemed not to make him any better. Olav took it for granted that Eirik was to blame. So courteous a woman as Marta Biggersdatter could hardly have expected the son of the Master of Hestviken to be so rude and childish an oaf. Until now, Eirik had never paid much attention to his little sister's doings, but on the other hand he had never been used to tease her. If now and then he turned to Cecilia, it would be to show her kindness and help her in her games. Now that too was changed. He was constantly in the way of the 2 little maids, provoking them and amusing himself by making Cecilia as savage as a young hawk. The other little girl simply shrank into a corner, dumb with misery. One evening Olav came in from outside. He stayed in the ante-room a while, getting out a chest of arrow shafts and feathers. He intended to spend the evening making ready some arrows for fowling. He moved noiselessly, as had been his habit in all the years when he had had so much on his mind. He had come to hate noise. He heard the children in the great room, Eirik and Cecilia. He was laughing, and she was angry. Olav looked in. Cecilia was sitting before the hearth on the little 3-legged stool which was her own. Tor, the old housecarl, had made it for her. She sat clutching the stool with both hands under the seat, and her feet braced against the floor. Her mouth was slightly puckered, and her eyes were round and staring. They were almost as blue in the whites as in the light pupils. She looked like a white, blue-eyed kitten crouching for a spring. Behind her stood Eirik. He put his foot under the stool and rocked it a little. Cecilia resisted with all her weight. Olav came into the room for a lantern. Eirik left his sister, but no sooner was his father back in the ante-room than he began again. He dangled a red hair ribbon, dropped it into the straw that covered the floor. Cecilia was to be quick and snatch it first, but Eirik was quicker still. Roaring with laughter, he dropped down and sat on her stool. His sister darted at him and seized his hair with both hands. She pulled it without making a sound. Eirik laughed and swung her this way and that, so that she fell into the hearth, put out her hands and got hold of a log which still had some heat in it. Then she set up a howl and turned furiously on her brother, spitting at him so that it dribbled down on her little chin. Olaf came in, seized Eirik's hand roughly and pulled it aside. The boy had gotten Cecilia by the hair when she tried to bite him. Her father lifted her up in his arms. "So you pull little girls by the hair, I see." "She pulled mine first." "Ah, did she?" Eirik turned red as blood. Cecilia remembered that she had burnt her hand and burst into a pitiable fit of crying. Olaf comforted her, found some candle grease and smeared the burnt place. Bothild came out of her corner and stood looking on. Olaf enjoyed being able to sit a while with Cecilia in his arms and the other little girl at his knee. Eirik he pretended not to see. But when Lady Marta and Ragnar came in with the food, and Marta asked what was the matter, Olaf answered, "Nothing." Then Cecilia looked up from her father's breast. "Mustn't Eirik give me my horse now, father?" "Indeed, he shall give you your horse." "'Tis not her horse," said Eirik, red as fire again. Then Marta put in a word. "I gave the children a little wooden horse, which I found in Eirik's bed when we changed the straw for Yule, and now they have been quarrelling over it for 12 weeks. Olaf smiled mockingly. "Is that wooden horse such a treasure, Eirik, that you can't let your sister have it?" "Yes," replied Eirik defiantly. "Mother carved it for me when I was a child." "Then, Cecilia, you must let Eirik have it," said Olav. "I will carve you as many wooden horses as you want." Later, after supper, Eirik came and asked if he might help his father with the arrows. Olaf said he could. Once when Eirik could not get the feathers to sit straight, Olaf paused in his work and looked at him. "I can't say that you are very handy, Eirik." This was not true. Eirik was deft and quick. It was only a fault in the wood of this shaft which made the groove for the feathers too shallow. One afternoon, some days later, father and son were down at the waterside, salting auks. Olaf flayed the birds, Eirik cut out the breasts, laid them in the kegs and salted them. Now and again Olaf dried his hands on the lappet of his coat. Eirik was tempted to do the same, but the salt stung his chapped and swollen hands so sharply that it was too painful even to touch the coarse woolen garment. The south wind howled and beat against the wall of the shed. Now and then a shower of rain poured down. Underneath the floor the waves splashed and gurgled, grinding the flakes of ice and breaking them against the rock. It was turning to foul weather. Eirik felt intensely happy at being allowed to stay here in the shed alone with his father and help him. King Hakon came from the border round by the north to Tunsberg just after Easter. It was then rumoured in the country about the fjord that the peace with the Danish king was to hold for 2 years more. Folks were glad of this, for the first tidings that had come from the king's meeting there said that in the spring King Hakon would ravage Denmark with a greater war fleet than ever before. But Olaf felt no gladness when he began the work of spring. It was wearisome to look forward to a whole summer at Hestviken. He did not ponder why the days should seem much more dreary now, when at last he was rid of the lingering torment of a wife who was always sick. In those days time had hung heavily on him. Now it went swiftly, although his mind was now filled with a never-ceasing patience. It was as though he had sold his soul and been cheated of the payment. It was not in order to busy himself about this farm here on the hill by the creek, to sail out with his fishing boats, to dig the ground, to visit the mill and go out to Saltviken, it was not for this he had finally silenced the voice that had urged and called to him for so long. The secret spiritual conflict which for 12 years had been his whole life was like a web woven by himself and one other, and he had acted as a woman who cuts down the tapestry from her loom, rolls it up and hides it in a locked chest. To Olaf it seemed as if he had thrown the key into the sea. But he had not done so in order to have these calm days, wearyingly alike, in its place. He had forgotten his doings in England and all the thoughts he had had there, better than he would have believed it possible for a man to forget such things. Nevertheless, a dim memory flickered forth of that which had turned the scale. The song of the retainers, and the salt-sweet taste of blood it brought back from his own brisk youth of outlawry, and he remembered the joy of grappling with foes of flesh and blood, footpads who used the knife in the darkness of the woods. It was as though these had been the bribes he was offered, no great matters, but enough to turn the scale in the hour when he was tempted to turn away from God for good and all, since it was so hard to return to the banner of his rightful Lord for a man who had become a traitor and a runaway. 30 pieces of silver are not so great a sum as to have tempted Judas, had it not been for that bag of our Lord's travelling resources, for which he would have had to account. And at times the thought came over Olaf this spring. He stood under the pale and boundless arch of the evening sky, still faintly yellow over the ridge on the western side of the fjord. The surface of the water beneath him loomed grey and restless, wrapped in an indefinite gloom where the darkness was gathering about the shores. Olaf washed the rough dirt from him in the tub before the house door. Whatever he might turn his hand to, every day's work began and ended in his toiling up and down the familiar paths to the yard, creeping to his rest within the closet. For an instant there came over him a temptation to do as Judas did. He had such a hellish loathing of going into the others. Early in the winter, when the talk was of war, Olaf had said that this year he would take Eirik with him on board. And so long as all men thought the fleet would sail, Eirik had been busy looking over all the things he was to take with him, and exercising himself in the use of his weapons. But when the word came that peace was not to be broken, Eirik was yet busier, and now his talk was that if, and if, and if. It galled Olaf every time he heard the lads boasting. Another thing that annoyed Olaf was that Eirik was continually humming and singing. It had not mattered so much while Eirik was a child. He had had such a clear, sweet voice. But now that his voice was breaking, he still sang as before, and it did not sound well. One noontide in the haymaking, Olaf sent Eirik home to the houses to fetch a rope. Time went on and on. A thunderstorm broke on the heights above Hudaheim's land. It was coming this way. The men worked hard to bring the dry hay under a rock shelter, and Olaf grew angrier and angrier as he carried great armfuls of hay. He ran up to the farm. In the yard stood Cecilia playing ball. She threw the ball against the wall of the storehouse and caught it in one hand. The other little free hand mimicked the action more feebly. Every time she threw the ball, she tossed her fair head so charmingly. Bothild sat on the ground looking on. All at once Eirik leapt in between his sister and the wall and caught the ball. He ran backwards across the yard, throwing the ball into the air and catching it, Cecilia following and trying to get it back. Sometimes Eirik pretended to throw it to her. "Catch it! Catch it!" And then he tricked her. Suddenly he threw it over the roof of the house. Then he caught sight of his father. He picked up the ropes, which he had flung down on the rock, and handed them to Olav. Could you not find some that were rottener? No, these are not rotten, father, said Eirik confidently. Olav put his foot in the hank, gave a tug, and threw away the broken ropes. Eirik was crossing over to the storehouse when his father ordered him sharply, "Find your sister's ball and give it to her." He went himself to find a fresh rope. In the storehouse all was in confusion. Olav hung everything in its place before he went out. He was making a loop in the new rope when he heard a disturbance in the dairy. It was Marta who had given the little girls some curds and cream to taste. But Eirik forced himself in and wanted to taste the curds too. Marta took hold of him and pushed him out. Eirik shouted angrily, "You behave as if you were mistress here. These are not your curds." Marta took no notice of him, but Cecilia made a grimace at her brother, finger in mouth. Eirik was furious and shouted louder, "'Tis not yours, I say! Nothing is yours here in our house. Even if my father allows you food and lodging, you and the brat you have with you." Then Olaf was at his side. "That was no courteous speech, Eirik. You must beg pardon of your foster-mother for it." Eirik was obstinate and defiant. He turned red. Olaf flared up wrathfully. "Beg Marta's pardon. Kiss the lady's hand and do as I bid." A flash of lightning cleft the black darkness over the fjord. Olaf counted under his breath as he waited for the thunderclap. The peal rolled away among the hills. "Be quick now. Do as I tell you, and then come out to the hay." Eirik did not move. Olaf let the leather thong run between his fingers. Coldly and quietly he said, "It is an age since you felt my hand on you, Eirik. But you do now as I have told you, else you shall taste this." He gave the rope a little shake. Eirik bent down on one knee and rapidly kissed Marta Biggersdatter's hand. But at that instant Olaf felt he could not bear to see the lad's miserable face. The father took the coil of rope and set off at a run for the fields. He did not even look round to see whether the boy followed him. Abundantly as Eirik had deserved the humiliation, Olaf hated having to force the lad thus on his knees before a stranger, and he hated Eirik for it.